It's their first taste of freedom. Researchers are releasing several Przewalski horses into the wild.
It's the only truly wild horse on Earth.
11 horses stepped off a cargo plane into a place where nothing was supposed to survive. Not grass, not water, not hope. Local ranchers in this stretch of northwestern China had a name for the land long before the horses arrived. They called it the place where nothing grows. And in December of 1986, a small group of Chinese scientists unloaded 11 zoo-born animals directly into the middle of it, convinced that these creatures, and only these creatures, could undo what decades of drought, overgrazing, and industrial expansion had done to an entire region of Xinjiang province. Almost nobody believed it would work. The horses in question were Przewalski's horses, the last truly wild horse species left on the planet, a subspecies so distinct from the domestic horses we know that its cells carry 66 chromosomes instead of 64. They had vanished from the wild in this exact region, the Xinjiang basin, near the end of the 1960s. Soviet field surveys recorded the last confirmed wild sighting around 1969, and after that, the species existed nowhere on Earth except behind fences, in zoos scattered across Europe and the United States, descended from a tiny handful of animals captured at the turn of the 20th century. To understand why bringing them back mattered so much, you first have to understand what had happened to the land in their absence. This wasn't simply a story about one endangered animal. It was a story about an entire ecosystem quietly dying, and a government trying to figure out, at almost any cost, how to stop it. For thousands of years, wild horses moved across the steppe of the Xinjiang basin the way bison once moved across the American plains, shaping the land with every hoofbeat. When they disappeared, the region did not just lose an animal. It lost a process. Without hooves breaking up the surface, the soil in parts of the basin hardened into a dense crust, and researchers studying the area in the 1970s and 1980s described soil conditions so degraded that some comparisons were drawn to lunar samples, a striking image scientists used to describe just how lifeless the ground had become. Rain still fell, but instead of soaking in, much of it ran off the hardened surface and evaporated before plants could use it. Vegetation struggled to take hold. And as the vegetation thinned, the desert began to expand. China was already living with the consequences of desertification on a national scale by the time this project began. Dust storms originating in the country's arid northwest were reaching Beijing with increasing frequency through the 1970s and 1980s, a well-documented environmental crisis that pushed the Chinese government to launch the Three North Shelter Belt program in 1978, often nicknamed the Green Great Wall. An enormous afforestation effort meant to hold the advancing sand back with tree lines stretching thousands of kilometers across the country's northern frontier. It was one of the most ambitious reforestation campaigns in human history. And in many of the driest regions, it ran into a problem that took years to fully appreciate. Trees planted in arid steppe consume enormous amounts of groundwater, and in some areas the Shelter Belt program drew down water tables faster than the desert soil could recover on its own, according to later assessments by Chinese forestry researchers themselves. Fighting a desert with thirsty trees, it turned out, was not a simple equation. It was against this backdrop, in the mid-1980s, that Chinese conservationists proposed something that must have sounded close to fantasy in a government meeting room. Instead of only planting more trees, bring back the animal that had shaped this land before it collapsed. Bring back the wild horse. The scientific case rested on decades of research into what Przewalski's horses actually are, and what made them so different from the domestic horses humans have bred for speed, strength, and temperament for thousands of years. The definitive account of the species' biology and near extinction is laid out in the 1994 volume Przewalski's Horse, The History and Biology of an Endangered Species, edited by biologists Lee Boyd and Catherine Houpt and published by SUNY Press, which remains one of the most cited references on the subspecies. The book documents how the entire global population by the mid-20th century had collapsed to just a few dozen animals, all descended from a narrow founding group captured in the wild around 1900 by expeditions financed by European zoo collectors. At the species' lowest point, after the disruptions of the Second World War, viable breeding populations existed in only a couple of institutions, most notably in Munich and in Prague, whose zoo maintained the international studbook that conservationists still rely on today to track the species' pedigree and manage its genetics. That a population this narrow could be rebuilt at all, let alone rebuilt to the point where animals could be sent back into the wild, is itself one of 20th century conservation's genuine success stories. Organizations including the Prague Zoo, along with European breeding centers and the Foundation for the Preservation and Protection of the Przewalski's horse founded in the Netherlands, spent decades carefully managing pairings to protect what little genetic diversity remained. By the mid-1980s, the global population had grown enough that some individuals could be considered for reintroduction rather than permanent captivity. China's plan, once approved, unfolded in careful stages rather than a single dramatic release. Horses imported from Western zoos were first brought to an acclimatization and breeding center near Jimsar, in Xinjiang, where researchers could monitor their health and begin the slow process of reconditioning zoo-raised animals to semi-wild conditions. Only later, once herds had grown and stabilized, would fully wild releases into protected reserve land become possible. That first winter tested everyone's assumptions. Animals raised for generations in enclosures, fed on schedule, sheltered from real weather, were suddenly facing a desert steppe where temperatures fall dramatically below freezing and snow can bury what little forage exists. Field reports and later scientific summaries of the Xinjiang program describe exactly the kind of losses conservationists feared were likely in those first difficult seasons: cases of frostbite, parasite loads, and the ordinary brutal math of animals relearning how to survive somewhere their bodies were built for, but their habits were not. It would have been entirely reasonable, at that point, for the project to be remembered as a well-intentioned failure. Instead, something researchers had hoped for but could not guarantee began to show up in the data. Behaviors nobody had taught these animals began to reappear. Horses that had never known a frozen pond in captivity began breaking surface ice with their hooves to reach water underneath. Mares began forming defensive clusters around foals during storms. None of this had been modeled for them by older herd members, because there were no older wild herd members left to learn from. What researchers were documenting, season after season, appeared to be something closer to instinct resurfacing than behavior being taught, evidence that generations of captivity had not erased the deep biological programming shaped by hundreds of thousands of years on the open steppe. As the herd stabilized through the late 1980s and 1990s, ecologists monitoring the release sites began noticing changes in the land itself. Vegetation cover in grazed areas started recovering in ways that surprised even supporters of the project. This tracks with a broader body of grassland ecology research showing that moderate, natural grazing pressure, as opposed to either overgrazing or the complete absence of large herbivores, can actually stimulate grass growth, a phenomenon ecologists call compensatory growth, where clipped grasses regrow thicker and more vigorously than unraised stands. Horse dung, meanwhile, does more than fertilize soil. Research on wild equids more broadly has documented that seeds passing through a horse's digestive tract often show improved germination rates compared to seeds that fall to the ground untouched, because the digestive process can help break down tough seed coats that would otherwise resist sprouting for years. Horses, unlike many animals, are also relatively inefficient digesters of plant material, which means a surprising number of viable seeds survive the trip through their gut entirely intact, ready to grow wherever the animal happens to leave them. By the early 2000s, China moved into the boldest phase of the program, releasing horses entirely, without fences, without supplemental feeding, into the wider protected landscape of what is now known as the Kalamaili Nature Reserve in Xinjiang. This mirrored a similar and slightly earlier effort in Mongolia, where Przewalski's horses were reintroduced into Hustai National Park beginning in 1992, a program supported by Dutch and Mongolian conservation organizations that has since become one of the most closely studied wild horse populations on Earth. Mongolian and international researchers tracking that population have published extensively on its recovery, and the Hustai project is frequently cited by conservation biologists as proof that reintroduction of a species extinct in the wild can genuinely succeed when it's paired with patient, long-term habitat protection. What both programs revealed, over time, was something ecologists now describe using the language of rewilding, the idea that certain species function as ecosystem engineers, meaning their ordinary daily behavior actively builds and maintains the habitat around them, not just occupies it. Bison did this on the American Great Plains. Elephants do it across African savannas by knocking down trees and opening grassland. Wolves reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park in the 1990s famously triggered cascading changes through the ecosystem, altering elk behavior enough to allow willow and aspen stands to recover along riverbanks, a phenomenon documented extensively by researchers including wildlife ecologist William Ripple at Oregon State University. Przewalski's horses, it turns out, may play a comparable role on the Central Asian steppe, animals whose grazing, trampling, and waste distribution don't just survive in a landscape but actively rebuild it. None of this means the recovery has been simple or complete. Reintroduced Przewalski's horse populations still face real threats, including disease, competition with livestock for limited grazing land, harsh winters that can cause significant die-offs, and the ongoing challenge of maintaining genetic diversity in populations that all descend from such a narrow founding group a century ago. The International Union for Conservation of Nature currently lists the species as endangered rather than fully recovered, a classification that reflects real caution among scientists even as the population trend has turned positive. China's Xinjiang population and Mongolia's Hustai and Komian Tao populations, along with additional reintroduction efforts in Kazakhstan's Golden Steppe project launched in cooperation with the Prague Zoo and other European partners in the 2020s, together represent a global population that has grown from that terrifying mid-century low into the thousands. Spread across reserves the animals had been absent from for decades. What makes this story resonate beyond a single species is the uncomfortable question it quietly raises. For much of the 20th century, the dominant response to environmental collapse was engineering. Plant more trees, build more infrastructure, apply more human labor and money to hold back a problem through sheer force of intervention. China's own Green Great Wall stands as a genuinely heroic and, in many places, effective effort along those lines. But in the specific case of the Xinjiang basin, something different happened almost by accident. Scientists reintroduced an animal not primarily to fix the land, but to save the animal itself from extinction, and in doing so accidentally rediscovered a far older, far more efficient technology than anything humans had engineered, a species that had spent hundreds of thousands of years evolving alongside this exact landscape, perfectly adapted to maintain it, simply by living the way it always had. There is something quietly humbling in that. Humans spent decades and enormous sums trying to out-engineer a desert with irrigation systems, tree plantations, and soil treatments, while the actual solution had been standing in a handful of zoo enclosures the entire time, waiting only to be set free. The Przewalski's horse never asked to become a symbol of ecological restoration. It simply did what it has always done: walk, graze, dig, and wander across land that remembers it, even after 17 years of silence. And in doing so, 11 animals that